I'd like to begin by thanking Security and Context and Omar Dahi in particular for this invitation. I'm going to focus on the United States, Israel, and the Palestinians, what Noam Chomsky refers to as a fateful triangle, particularly during the period since the Second World War. But first, several preliminary comments. The involvement of the US government and of various American institutions, organizations, and individuals in this question, of course, predates 1945. But Palestine was not seen as a particularly significant issue by decision makers in Washington before the US became a global power during the 1940s. Seen from the vantage point of the region, there were also two important developments before the Second World War ended. The first was the 1942 Biltmore Conference, convened in New York by the Zionist movement. The resulting Biltmore program has gone down in history as a moment in which the movement renounced Britain's project for a Jewish national home in Palestine, what the British governor of Jerusalem, Ronald Storrs, had termed a Jewish Ulster in the Middle East, and instead of this, explicitly identified statehood independent of Britain as its strategic objective. But just as importantly, Biltmore was also the moment when the Zionist movement shifted its allegiance from London to Washington. The second was the February 1945 meeting between President Roosevelt and Saudi King Abdulaziz, better known as Ibn Saud. The meeting focused primarily on Palestine and oil, and is remembered for Roosevelt's pledge 2 months before his death, and soon to be violated by his successor, Truman, that Washington would effect no change in its policy on Palestine without full and prior consultation with both Jews and Arabs. The meeting also established a pattern in which Washington viewed the question of Palestine primarily as a function of its relations with the Arab states. U.S. bilateral relations with the Palestinians, if they existed at all, would for succeeding decades be subordinate to relations with the Arab states, and thereafter, of course, to the U.S.-Israeli alliance. The manner in which Truman violated Roosevelt's pledge to Ibn Saud has ever since colored our perceptions of how this fateful triangle operates. Specifically, Truman, in November of 1945, rejected warnings by U.S. diplomats stationed in the Middle East about the dangers of supporting the Zionist objective of statehood in Palestine, and he did so with the following words, and I now quote, "I'm sorry, gentlemen, but I have to answer to hundreds of thousands who are anxious for the success of Zionism. I do not have hundreds of thousands of Arabs among my constituents." End quote. Truman's statement falls squarely within the long-standing debate about U.S. policy towards the Palestine question. Is this policy primarily determined by domestic pressure groups, and specifically by what is known as the Israel lobby? Or should we understand Israel as a U.S. proxy, a client regime, doing Washington's bidding and advancing its interests in the Middle East and elsewhere as well? A review of the relevant history demonstrates that it's not an either-or question, and that different dynamics prevail at different times for differing reasons. On the one hand, tails don't wag dogs. On the other, dogs do herd livestock, and sheep in particular. As Truman intimated, the first key policy decision on the plate of the United States with respect to the Palestine question concerned the establishment of a Jewish state. As the General Assembly of the newly formed United Nations was considering the matter in 1947, Washington put the entirety of its weight behind partition, as opposed to federation. It was one of the few cases during the Cold War during which the United States and the Soviet Union were on the same page, and the partition resolution adopted by the United Nations General Assembly of 29 November 1947 duly passed. Nevertheless, as it became clear to Washington during the spring of 1948 that partition was proving extraordinarily violent as well as extraordinarily disruptive, and fears grew of a broader regional war after the end of the British Mandate in May of that year, as well as of the opportunities this would provide for the Soviet Union, a shift in U.S. policy from partition towards a UN trusteeship was under active consideration. Intensive Zionist lobbying was required to ensure that Truman would stay the course and that Washington would recognize the State of Israel upon its proclamation the day the British left Palestine. During the 1956 Suez Crisis, by contrast, no amount of Zionist lobbying succeeded in persuading Washington to support Israel's invasion of Egypt. The Eisenhower administration was firmly opposed to the British and French plot to reestablish their dominance of the Middle East at U.S. expense, and equally opposed to Israel's participation in this scheme, a role which the Israeli leader David Ben-Gurion likened to that of a prostitute. Israel was ordered to evacuate the Sinai Peninsula and the Gaza Strip, and did as it was told. At a time when conspiracy theories about an Israeli role in the Kennedy assassination are gaining ground, it is often forgotten that it was in fact JFK who first used the term special relationship to refer to Washington's connection with Israel. Kennedy was also the first U.S. president to authorize weapons sales to Israel. Yet these advances in the U.S.-Israeli relationship also reveal that it had not been particularly central or particularly important to U.S. Middle East policy during the 1950s and first half of the 1960s. Indeed, Israel won the 1967 June War on the strength of French rather than American arms. The 1967 war also introduced the Palestinians as an independent variable into the Middle East equation. Until that year, Washington had related to them primarily as a refugee question, a humanitarian issue, the unfinished business of the 1948 Nakba. The Palestine question had become subsumed within the Arab-Israeli conflict, its resolution subordinated to and seen as but one element of broader U.S. regional policy and diplomacy. United Nations Security Council Resolution 242 of 1967, for example, which established the Land for Peace formula that, at least formally, served as a basis for U.S. diplomacy for the coming decades, does not mention the Palestinians at all, relegating them to the phrase, a just resolution of the refugee question. At a time of rising Cold War tensions and of U.S. failure in Vietnam, Israel's strategic victory, its lightning victory in 1967, achieved over Moscow's closest and best supplied Arab partners, catapulted the Jewish state to most favored nation status. Advanced U.S. weaponry subsequently flowed freely to Israel, and U.S. concurrence with Security Council resolutions condemning Israeli violations and atrocities was gradually replaced by ever more frequent U.S. vetoes. Israeli predominance joined oil and opposition to Soviet influence as core U.S. Middle East policy objectives. The Palestinians, who erupted onto the scene through the various guerrilla movements acting collectively within the framework of the PLO, were seen as not only a threat to Israeli dominance, but also as a conduit for Soviet influence in the region and a threat to regional stability, and thus to the stable supply of oil. But more importantly, Washington had bigger fish to fry in the Middle East. Resolving the Palestine question was more important to Israel than it was to the United States, which meant that Israel was generally allowed to do as it pleased on this file, given a free hand, provided this did not interfere with U.S.-Arab relations or the other U.S. Objectives that I enumerated. The Israel lobby gained in power because U.S. support for Israel had expanded, not the other way around. The lobby won multiple victories on issues of vital importance to Israel because these issues were of only marginal significance to Washington. The unprecedented U.S. airlift to Israel during the October 1973 war, by contrast, did not require an Israel lobby because Washington saw that war as a U.S.-Soviet proxy conflict. Yet, when Israel and its lobby did everything within their power to prevent the Reagan administration from selling advanced AWACS aircraft to Israel in to Saudi Arabia in 1981, they were powerless. Israel's reputation as a state with 100 senators did it little good, and the sale of these aircraft sailed through the Knesset's Washington branch office, also known as the U.S. Senate. 2 years earlier, President Carter had high ambitions of resolving not only the Arab-Israeli conflict, but also the question of Palestine, which forms its core. The diplomatic record is quite clear on this, as are Carter's statements early in his administration endorsing a Palestinian homeland and Carter's subsequent memoirs. Ultimately, however, Washington had to make a choice. It could go for a separate Egyptian-Israeli peace, which would remove the most powerful Arab military from the equation, consolidate U.S. regional preeminence, and provide a welcome boost to the U.S. after the Soviet invasion of Afghanistan and after the Shah of Iran had been overthrown and replaced by Ayatollah Khomeini's Islamic Republic. Or Carter could invest his rapidly diminishing political capital in compelling Israeli Prime Minister Menachem Begin to relinquish the occupation of the West Bank and Gaza Strip. Both options, to be sure, were available to Carter, but he chose the easy way out. Carter subsequently did insist that he had obtained from Israel a commitment for a settlement freeze of a particular in the West Bank and Gaza Strip, but this was violated, and the U.S. did not respond to it. It was one more example of impunity without consequences, because here again, we're dealing with an issue that was much more important to Israel than it was to the United States. And Washington would allow Israel to go its merry way so long as it did not interfere with other core U.S. policy objectives in the region. Nevertheless, freed of the need to defend its southern front, Israel in 1982 launched a full-scale invasion of Lebanon to rid itself of its Palestinian problem once and for all. It did so with full U.S. support, and it bears recollection that when Israel invaded Lebanon in 1982, it announced to the world that it was engaged in something it called Operation Peace for Galilee, the purpose of which was to push the Palestinian guerrillas some 40 kilometers north of the Israeli-Lebanese border. In fact, the operation's real name was Operation Big Pines, and its purpose was to eradicate the PLO, kill its leadership, expel the Palestinians from Lebanon, provoke a Republican uprising against the Hashemite monarchy in Jordan, which would be transformed into a alternative Palestinian state, and in so doing, pave the way for Israeli annexation of the West Bank and the Gaza Strip. The Reagan administration turbocharged the U.S.-Israeli relationship, transforming it into a partnership of extremism. Nevertheless, the subsequent 1987 uprising in the occupied Palestinian territories demonstrated that the status quo had become untenable. As importantly, in 1990, Iraq invaded, occupied, and annexed Kuwait. By this point, the Cold War was also winding down. But at the same time, the U.S. was obliged to initiate a diplomatic process, what became known as a peace process, as the price for Arab cooperation with Operation Desert Storm. Israel rejected this process. It was able to tinker with the formula, but in the end was left with no choice but to attend. This formed the genesis of the subsequent 1993 Oslo Accords. Now, Oslo needs to be seen, I think, in the context of the end of the Cold War. The US had no more need for this conflict. There was no proxy war with a rival global power to be prosecuted through Israel. And direct engagement with the Palestinians became possible. In the context of US unipolarity, conflict resolution became a end in and of itself. But the manner in which the US approached the implementation of the Oslo agreements is very telling. On the one hand, there was direct engagement with the Palestinians. I think PLO leader Yasser Arafat visited the Clinton White House perhaps as often as any other foreign leader. But at the same time, Palestinian rights were consistently subordinated to Israeli interests. Every proposal that the United States put forward was effectively promulgated through the prism of what Israel could accept rather than what international resolutions, international law, and so on, what the international consensus identified as inalienable Palestinian rights. And this ultimately led to the collapse of the Oslo process because the US insisted on having exclusivity, hegemony over this political process in a context in which it viewed one of the parties, Israel, as a strategic partner, and the other, the PLO, as a terrorist organization on probation. And it made an effort, of course, to keep the United Nations, the Europeans, and others out of the process. Their role was effectively limited to funding and so on. Then, at the beginning of this century, you had the 9/11 attacks in the United States, followed by the US global war on terror, invasion of Iraq, and so on. And here, once again, you begin to see a full and increasingly unconditional US Israeli partnership. Israel was able to successfully mobilize the global war on terror in the same way to perform a function similar to that which it had played during the Cold War and the rivalry with the Soviet Union. And in this case, Palestinians were increasingly seen as part of the enemy camp. And this worked enormously to Israel's advantage. Now, I'd like to conclude by talking about the most recent developments. For the past 2 years, of course, in the aftermath of the Palestinian attacks into southern Israel of October 2023, we've had the Gaza genocide. And most recently, and late last year, we had the re-election of the Trump administration. And in late September, Trump announced the Gaza Initiative, which has now taken the form of the Board of Peace. And the question that needs to be asked is, where is this heading? Well, if one looks at the contours that are being proposed by Washington for the future of the Palestine question, it becomes very clear that there is a renewed attempt by Washington to depoliticize the Palestine question. In other words, to once again transform it from a question about rights, about self-determination, about Palestinian statehood and sovereignty, into a humanitarian question, a question of refugees who require food, tents, education, healthcare, and so on. And the US hopes that in doing so, the Palestine question will simply disappear from the agenda, that the Arab states who are increasingly close with Washington will not only accept this formula, but participate in it. And if one looks at everything that has come out of the Board of Peace, there really is no political dimension on the horizon. It's exclusively about issues such as humanitarian assistance, reconstruction, demilitarization, and so on, even if the plan is implemented as formulated. And I don't see this happening. The primary purpose, I think, is to liquidate the question of Palestine as a political question and replace it with a humanitarian agenda. Thank you very much.